Welcome to the latest edition of our Living Archaeology site visit series. And today I'm going to be introducing you to one of the more bizarre sites I've ever visited in one of the more obscure countries. Now, we're going to be talking about Lepenski Vir, a Neolithic site in Serbia. Serbia is right at the heart of Europe, but it's actually very little visited. I think probably due to some of the geopolitical isolation of the country as a result of the terrible events and the wars in the Balkans in the 1990s. Now, in general, the Balkans is getting a lot more visited. I've been there a few times, but at the top of most people's itineraries would be Croatia, Slovenia, and increasingly Albania and Montenegro. Serbia is usually not on the itinerary. I've been to places as random as Uzbekistan, Djibouti, but never have I been to a place where I had fewer expectations than Serbia. I just hadn't heard much about it and knew very few people who've been there. However, that said, Serbia, the northeastern part of Serbia, and this site totally blew me away. So I'm going to be talking to you more about it. Now, this is classified as one of the oldest urban sites in Europe and maybe the first. Now, we have to use the term urban pretty liberally, given how small scale the site is. I think at no time were there more than a couple hundred people living there. That said, it is very old and it is very strange. The site is located in Djerdap National Park, about a 2 hours drive due east of Belgrade, the capital. That said, the roads are really good and flat, so it's an easy drive. Djerdap National Park is on the southern shore of the Danube River, which starts in Germany and empties out in Ukraine. During that journey, it flows through 10 countries and 4 national capitals. So this is on the southern bank of the Danube in Serbia, and right across the way is Romania. Now, in the park, you'll find the Iron Gates, a particularly scenic stretch of the river with limestone cliffs on both sides. The park is great for hiking and trails, and there's quite a bit to see there. Also in the park, you'll find Trajan's plaque, named after the Roman Emperor Trajan. This was sort of a billboard advertising Rome's power, as this site was once the frontier of the empire, and so it was sort of warning to the barbarians beyond Rome's borders of their power. You'll also find majestic Goldjebek Fortress, perched right on the riverside very majestically. Built in the 14th century, it was occupied at various times by the Ottomans, the Hungarians, the Bulgarians, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So there's quite a bit of history there, and Serbia does have a very turbulent history. Now, some of the sites, including Lepenski Vir, which we'll be talking about, and Trajan's plaque, had to be moved up because the river was flooded by a dam project in the 1970s. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. However, we're going back much further than that. 6,000 years before Rome was even a thing. That's when our site, Lepenski Vir, was abandoned. Weird's the word, and there's quite a few things that make this site very unique. It was first occupied probably at 9,000 BC, that's the earliest dating evidence, for almost 4,000 years until about 6,000 BC. And it contained about 130 to 140 different houses, but that wasn't all concurrently. So at any given time, the size of the village fluctuated. At its peak, it might have been a few hundred people living there. But it's hard to tell because the houses were built and rebuilt again, sometimes right on top of the other or overlapping. So it's a bit of a messy site given the long time frame of occupation. One of the things that makes the site so exciting is it's one of the few places you can see the transition from Mesolithic to Neolithic, from hunter-gatherer to farmer. And there's a few reasons for that. First of all, it's located by a particularly oxygen-rich portion of the river, probably because this turbulent portion of the river has a lot of eddies that will make sort of different subclimates, underwater climates in the river. It's also surrounded by dense forests, so that's perfect for hunting and fishing. However, as agriculture was introduced, even though there's a very steep and sheer topography to the place, there's certain sort of geological features and features of the rock that cause this particular location to retain the soil well. In other words, not to be eroded into the river. And that proved to be very, very beneficial for agriculture. So this was a pretty ideal location to sustain a small village. And it's also pretty much accepted that there were some small out settlements that have not yet been found and probably won't be because the site was flooded. But you can understand why people lived there for so long. And again, very rare to find this because hunter-gatherers are usually nomadic. They often didn't stay in one place. And if they did, it's hard to find traces of that. Continuing with the oddity, even despite its age, the village seems to have had a sustained and kind of regular layout in a horseshoe shape, arrayed with the houses facing the river around what appears to be a central and communal space. So, was this a very, very early attempt at zoning and urban planning? Was this a way to use the land efficiently given the small space? There's even some suggestion that given that small space and given the fact that the village never grew to a certain size, there may have been a birth control sort of policy in place to keep it from being overpopulated and outgrowing the resources in this tight area. However, the houses themselves are what's really bizarre. And when I talk about the houses, it's important to note that what I'm talking about is the last phase of development for the village, which started around 6300 BC. And that's what you can see today if you go there. We have to realize how durable these houses were. The floors were made out of a mixture of ash, dung, limestone. It created a concrete-like surface that survives even today. And when you compare that to the big cardboard McMansions you'll see on all those HGTV shows, it makes you think these people were at least perhaps more advanced than we were in that sense. Anyway, for archaeologists, house floors are kind of the jackpot because it shows you how the house was laid out and often what activities were done in the house. And there's often remains, even microscopic, on the floors of the house that tell you a lot about people, what they ate, where they slept, maybe even some of the diseases or sicknesses they had. So a house floor, when you can find it intact, is really valuable. And what's so strange is the houses, though they varied greatly in size, all had a regular trapezoidal shape that's not been seen anywhere. And for a long time, the archaeologists were puzzled as to what this could mean. There didn't seem to be any functional purpose in shaping a house like this. And it wasn't until one day when the archaeologists who excavated the place, and more about them later, looked up and they saw the sun, I believe, rising over Treskavat Peak. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's a mountain across the river in Romania. And with the sun behind that mountain, they realized it was the same trapezoidal shape. And with the sun behind it, it was very clear. So the people who built this village seem to have designed their house in that shape. And this must have somehow been part of their religious practice or belief system. What's on the floor of each house is also uniform and difficult to explain. So in the center, there's a rectangular hearth built of stone blocks. Now, that this is a hearth is pretty beyond argumentation because there's lots of evidence for burning, and every house has that. In front of that hearth is a sort of rectangular depression, which might be some kind of altar or like a receptacle for a libation. And nobody really knows what it is, other than it could be, something for a ritual purpose. And behind the hearth is another sort of stone area, which seems to be a shrine of some sort. And on that shrine are these truly bizarre river stones, which are carved with faces in them that look partially human and partially like fish. And again, there's no explanation for this other than it must be some sort of ritual or spiritual purpose to that. So yeah, ritual. And these stone heads, these mysterious fish-like stone heads, are said to be the oldest monumental sculptures in Europe. Finally, beneath the homes are often found human burials. And in many of these, the skull is disarticulated or buried separately from the body, and those are exclusively male. On the other hand, they often find jaw bones, mandibles, but those are exclusively female. So I don't know, maybe the men didn't want their wives talking shit about them even in death? Not much is known about how these houses actually appeared, but there's some evidence that they developed over time, with the earlier phases just sort of being covered with a tent-like structure. And after that, there's some large stones that indicate supports for a more substantial structure. And behind the village, there's a burial ground and a midden, which is sort of a fancy term for a garbage dump. So how was this site discovered? Like so many amazing archaeological sites, the terracotta warriors come to mind by a farmer. There was a guy, a farmer named Milosevic, no relationship to the maniacal genocidal dictator, but he found some remains, I think, in 1960. And then the site was first looked at by an archaeologist in 1965. Not much happened until 1965 when the archaeologist Dragoslav Srejovic secured the funding to excavate. He led the project along with archaeologist Zagorka Letica. Now, I know I probably butchered those names, so apologies. The project lasted 6 years until 1971, as the archaeologists just kept finding more and more layers of stratigraphy, in this case, floor houses, representing thousands of years of occupation. But there was a big impetus to get the project done because the whole thing was about to be flooded by a big hydroelectric dam project. Because of that project, the whole site, the whole big block of earth, had to be moved up about 30 meters or 100 feet above the original situation. Same with Trajan's plaque, which I mentioned earlier. That's pretty controversial because even though the site was preserved, it's not in situ, it's not in its original location, which is what you're supposed to do with archaeology. But this is an example where archaeology was heading for a head-on collision with a clear economic interest. And in that case, although the site is preserved, the economic interest took precedence. That's kind of a big no-no. So there's a suggestion that's why this was not nominated and to this day is not a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I find that a little bit hard to believe because there's a very famous Egyptian temple complex that I'm sure you'd recognize that I visited some years ago called Abu Simbel. Now that was the same thing was done to that. It was moved up as the Nile was dammed, happened at a very similar time. That was in 1968. And Abu Simbel is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So why Lepenski Vir is not, I'm not totally sure. However, there is some particular controversy with Lepenski Vir's being moved because there are claims that it was done in kind of a shoddy way with some of the concrete floors crumbling in transit, and claims that not the whole site was excavated. That may possibly be because I believe this was done by then the government of Yugoslavia, which may have lacked some of the expertise. When Egypt, which is sort of an archaeological theme park, moved Abu Simbel, they had a lot of international help and a lot of experience with archaeology. Anyway, once the site was reassembled in the higher location, it was developed for tourism, and a glass housing was built over it to protect the site. Research continued, and in the year 2018, the journal Nature published a few articles about the site. Remember, it was really first excavated and studied in the 60s and 70s, so quite a lot had advanced since then. One of these was a better techniques around radiocarbon dating, and new tests on samples of human and animal bone and charcoal yielded a starting date for the site at 9,900 BC, which was significantly earlier than previously thought, and it helped delineate several distinct phases in the site. Then, as part of a big human genome ancient DNA project in southeastern Europe taking place, it was determined that the original Mesolithic population of Lepenski Vir uh, faced an incoming wave of migrants at the start of the Neolithic period. And at this time, the 8th millennium BC, it seemed these two populations mixed. And that's different than what happened in other parts of Europe with this population wave of migrants, where it seems that the two populations live separately, and in different areas, one killed the other out. Here we have an apparent mixing between the two populations. And it suggested that that's what sort of started the mixing and creation of a new culture, which is what we're seeing in the 7th millennium BC in the form of these weird trapezoid houses and the strange fishmen heads. So that's what gave birth to this unique culture, a mixing of two genetically distinct populations, which presumably had very different traditions. Also in 2014, some archaeoastronomers surveyed the site, and they found an interesting finding, which is that Trescovat Peak, that one where the archaeologists think that's the explanation for the trapezoid shape of the floor houses. Well, these archaeoastronomers said that Trescovat Peak on the summer solstice has a double sunrise. So the sun rises, passes behind the mountain, and continues to rise. And that double sunrise is the reason for the location of the village at this particular spot. Now, I'm a little skeptical of that because you often hear arguments about this site being built this way or in this place because of a solstice or an eclipse, some reason like that. And oftentimes it turns out to be something else. I'd have to hear the full range of arguments about the location of the site in relation, let's say, to other resources and other practical reasons before I'm fully convinced. The site is interesting enough to merit a visit by itself, but the on-site museum, unlike some of those in Belgrade, actually does the subject matter lots of credit. So it's probably, even if you're very slow and considered, it shouldn't take you more than 2 hours to see the whole thing, but probably more like 60 to 90 minutes. There's a lot of the artifacts on site. So some of those fishmen, the bones, the pottery, they have a fair amount of the material there, which is a nice touch. It's not like many other places, like, for example, in certain sites of Greece, like Mycenae, where all the stuff is carted off and put in the National Museum. You will see some of the stuff in the National Museum in Belgrade, but you see plenty on site. And the glass structure that they've built over is a nice touch because it's protective over the site, protecting it from the elements. But it does give you a chance to see the natural situation. Now, we know, of course, it's not in exactly the same spot because that spot has been flooded due to the hydroelectric dam. But it gives you a sense of this spot overlooking the river and with the mountains across, which is where the houses supposedly got their shape from. So all in all, it's a really kind of nice ambiance. Now, the layout of the site is really cool. It's in an amphitheater-like setting, so you can see it from above, below, all around, and you can see very clearly the horseshoe-shaped kind of layout of the village. You also see the stratigraphy, different, the floor plans, those trapezoidal house floors on different levels, all of the same phase, but I suppose there are some that are not contemporaneous with each other. So it really is a good way to see the archaeology quite clearly. For this archaeologist, that was a plus. There's also a pretty quirky video, one of the more memorable site videos I've ever seen. It's a mixture of strange music, videos of the actual excavation, some of the archaeologists kind of fooling around, and some other long, draggy scenes that are, I guess, supposed to make you think about what, I'm not sure. But I'll show you some of that a little bit later.
Ispod same površine otkriveno je naselje starijeg neolita sa materijalom već dobro poznate starčevačke kulture. U zemunicama i kolibama od blata našli smo glinene posude raznih oblika i figurine domaćih životinja koje su verovatno imale religiozni značaj. Ovde smo otkrili i ovu žrtvenu vazu izuzetne lepote.
Slušajući valjda samo sopstvenu intuiciju, Srejović je odlučio da ide dalje u dubinu. Bio je to sudbonosan dan.
Lepenski Vir plus some of the other sites in the region, like at Djerdap, make for a nice 3 or 4 day road trip. I definitely recommend a visit to Goljubac Fortress and take a boat ride down the river. On that boat tour, you can see some of the other sites like Trajan's plaque. There's also this really cool giant stone carved head of an ancient Romanian king. He's a local folk hero who defied the Romans till the bitter end. He was eventually captured and killed, but he was a sign of local resistance and someone in the consciousness of the Romanian people. I was the only non Serbian on the boat tour, and I actually had my own special English guide, one on one. His dad was the captain of the boat. He was very professional for his age. I based myself in the village of Donji Milanovac, about a 15-minute drive to the east. That's full of little guest houses. I myself stayed with a family with a few kids, learned a lot about the locals. Most of the people living there have local roots or just across the river in Romania. So it was quite a good experience. And at $30 to $40 a night, maybe 50. It was also cheap as chips, very comfortable. You also have to try this restaurant called Restaurant Varnica. It's in this strange structure overlooking the river. I believe that's kind of an old signal station when this was an important navigational point. And you get an excellent view with some great river fish. That was really one of a kind and also very, very affordable. About 45 minutes east of Donji Milanovac, there's some other cool sites. There's another old Ottoman fort, and there's some, not much to see, but you can see some of the pilings that are remnants of what was Trajan's Bridge. Now, that was a bridge the Romans built to give their soldiers easy access to the other side of the river, the now Romanian side, when they were conquering the whole area. Ironically, those same Romans tore that bridge down when they were in full retreat, as the barbarians were on the march. I think that was in the 4th or 5th century. Kind of ironic, isn't it? When the Romans build that bridge to conquer, they're pacifying. When the other folks come back to conquer, they're pillaging, and that makes them barbarians. Everybody got that? Not far from Trajan's Bridge is a very well-preserved Roman fort named Diana. I'm not sure why the feminine name. It sounds to me kind of like what people would name their boats. But anyway, it was a good visit, free. You'll have to be careful, though. While I was there, I was attacked and nearly killed by some ferocious wild dogs. And one thing you'll appreciate about Lepenski Vir, other than the cheap, I think it was $4 entry fee, is the site was open quite late, like 8 or 9 o'clock. That was great for me because it gave me the whole day to see the sites in the region. And don't you just hate it how so many museums close at 5? So that was really appreciated. A bit further afield, about an hour southeast of Donji Milanovac, down some really rough roads, you'll find the 14th century Vratna Monastery. While atmospheric, the real draw here are 3 huge natural arches obtainable by a short and very scenic hike. And about an hour south of there, although quicker if you're driving directly from Donji Milanovac, you'll find the wine villages of the Negotin wine region. There are a few of these villages, but I visited Rogljevo and Rajac. Again, I'm probably mispronouncing those. But these 2 wine villages were really cool. They were living historical and archaeological sites in and of themselves. You see, wine has been grown and produced here since the Roman times, and they have these unique wine cellars which are built into the earth, sort of underneath or beside their houses, kind of like little hobbit holes. So it's a very, very long tradition of winemaking. However, during communist times, a lot of the knowledge was lost, and a lot of the wine you'll find there is cloyingly sweet, kind of like Robitussin or Manischewitz, if you're familiar with kosher wine. However, I, by chance, met a group of Serbian emigres who had left during the communist years to go to Italy, and they had learned proper winemaking, which they then brought back to them, to this region where their roots were. So actually, there were some pretty decent wines, a very unique Merlot that I had. So watch this space as these wines get better and maybe more appreciated on the international scene. I stayed in an old manor house in Rajac, built during the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The owner was from the original family, so it was her family that built the place. Now, she didn't speak a lick of English. I don't speak any Serb, but we somehow made it work. Body language, jumping up and down, and oh yeah, Google Translate. And this I can't take any credit for because it was totally by dumb luck. But I happened to go there during the annual wine festival, which is only one day, I believe, of the neighboring village, Rogljevo. So my Italian Serb friends that I met by chance, they brought me around. We sampled the wine, listened to the music, played games. And other than a couple of Germans and maybe an Italian and a few Russians I met there, I was like the only foreigner. So it was a really cool experience. One of those things you can't plan, you can't pay money for, but which you will never forget. Totally unique touristic experience. Now, I don't remember much of what happened after 11:30 p.m. So let's just say what happens in Rogljevo stays in Rogljevo. So overall, I highly recommend a visit to Lepenski Vir and its surroundings in this northeastern corner of the country. For a compact, affordable, well-organized, interesting museum and a totally sui generis site, Lepenski Vir is definitely worth a visit. Now, slight demerits for moving the whole site out of its original context, some of the degradation that caused to the houses, although you don't see that, and some of the flooding of the original houses that are now below the water, it gets slight demerits, but I'd still give it like a 4.5 out of 5. Not a lot of foreign visitors go to this place, so why don't you become the next visitor? I doubt many of your friends will have seen it. So check it out, Lepenski Vir in Serbia, Djerdap National Park. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.